Welcome to the first RAXPOD beta during a UFC fight week. No more 45 minutes of me rambling into the void this week. We've actually got important things to talk about. So, even though there's a lot of interesting things going on MMA Twitter this weekend, and Twitter itself, part of the reason I wanted to put this on both YouTube and Twitter is because long-form media seems to be going viral very easily on this space these days if you're paying attention to the developments of the weekend. So, I want to make this as accessible as possible for everyone. Get as much fight knowledge out there as we can. It is 10 a.m. Eastern in Miami, Florida at the moment. Hopefully get this up in about 2 hours, but, ran into some technical difficulties last week, and I'm thinking we might have some similar stuff coming up too. So I will get it to you as quickly as possible. I'll try to give you some sort of vehicle to kill time with before the prelims kick off at, I believe, 6 Eastern tonight. And got a little interesting slate of fights. People poo-poo these Apex events. I mean, it's just so funny to me because hardly any of the MMA media went to UFC Charlotte. And yet all of these journalists are the ones that are criticizing the UFC for not getting out of the Apex and being cheap. And then they'll just be just as cheap themselves with their travel arrangements. It's completely ridiculous. The flagship brands of this space even won't go to the road shows and then, lambast these Apex events. This isn't a card to the stars. It's bizarre that Daniel Pineda is in a co-main in 2023. But listen, opportunity creates value, and we'll certainly get into that towards the end of the show for Mr. Pineda. However, we got to start with the beginning of the card, the prelims, which is a light heavyweight bout between Mr. Maxim Grishin and Felipe Lins. Grishin coming in about a 130 favorite right now. Lins available as a plus 110 dog. If you caught my pick at the top of the week, you saw we had Lins at plus 120. So you see the line has come down a bit. On Bet Online at the moment, he is currently plus 104. So that line is narrowing. As the day goes on, it'll be interesting to see how it closes. If you caught them at weigh-ins yesterday, Grishin's a big dude, but he is 39 and he looks 39. Lins is 37 and looks significantly younger than that. I wonder if USADA is going to come knocking, honestly, after this fight, looking at Mr. Lins, wondering, sir, you're looking pretty good. And the reason I say that is because if you've followed the recent trajectory of Lins, you see that he is a guy that has been uncharacteristically improving beyond the age at which fighters usually decline. Now, that's not necessarily something to imply that foul play is involved here. We have seen fighters in the modern era make developments and advancements and go on runs in their careers that, frankly, we didn't expect. It particularly seems to be a trait among Brazilian fighters of late, whether you're looking at the renaissance of Glover Teixeira's career going on his title run into his 40s, or even a guy like Charles Oliveira, who, while not necessarily out of his prime age yet, is very much recognized as someone that wears far more attrition and has been through far more wars than a lot of other fighters. And yet, despite that, was still able to go on an uncharacteristic run from this journeyman into a UFC champion, which is not something you see for a guy who's been through that much in his career. Lins has been around the block a little bit, but has never looked better than he has in his last 2 fights, frankly. And there'll still be a lot of chin concerns, but you just can't... ring rust is one of the biggest things I look at here, and you just can't discount the fact that we saw Lins knock out Ovince St. Preux in less than a minute earlier this year, only 4 months ago. And prior to that, fought a very controlled fight against Marcin Prachnio, who I had graded to win and had picked to win back then, and did so under the impression that I didn't really think Lins was going to deploy takedowns because it wasn't something that he had done that much in his UFC career to that point, or at least in his recent fight demonstrations of fights. But he did it against Pragnio in a way that he was able to score the upset. And then against Ovince St. Preux, he was able to once again, dictate the fight. And I believe St. Preux was the underdog. I did pick him to win that fight, and he did not. So Lins, again, has been a scorn for me twice. So I am picking him here because we haven't seen Grishin in, I believe, nearly a year and a half. And the guy is 2 years older than Lins. And the two most recent wins Lins has had is better than anything that we can really compare for Grishin, unfortunately. I know a lot of people, like his size and are comfortable with his striking, but the guy doesn't have as much well-roundedness to his game as Lins does. And a big theme for this card, I think, is going to be looking at trajectories for these fighters rather than narratives for these fighters. I do think that Lins here, given what he's been showing recently, is on the better curve than Grishin is at 39 years old, having not only not fought in so long, but he also had about a year of ring rust going into his previous appearance, and he was a guy that was really only fighting on an annual basis. So not a lot of experience to draw on for recent years of fights compared to a guy like Lins who's put himself in there and has gone after it. So there's been value on Lins all week since plus 120, and you've seen that dropping. I think you can probably feel comfortable going to put a unit on him, and I would expect him to get it done inside the distance. Could get interesting if it goes to a decision, but if it does go to a decision, it's at your own discretion to bet on a Russian to come out favorably with the judges right now. So, and that'll be something that I get back to with Mr. Tim Elliott later on today. But picking Lins, good underdog play on this card. I think there's a couple of those, but I think he's a good one to start out. And good run of recent performances lately. Could get caught, but I think he gets the job done inside the distance on Mr. Grishin. So. Next fight, Damon Blackshear, Luan Lacerda. I'm not going to have much to say about this one just because we haven't gotten to see much effectiveness out of either one of these guys at this point. What I will say is, for Blackshear's case, there were a lot of people that were way in on Basharat. Like, I believe he opened as... I don't know if he opened or closed, but he was in the range of a 350, 400 favorite when they fought each other last night. I did pit Basharat to win, but you'd have to, be supremely confident to play someone at that price. I don't think he quite performed up to that in at least the first half of the fight. Basharat kind of, did a better job of sealing the deal as the fight wore on, but Blackshear, for the underdog value he was at in the first half, I think the people that picked him in spite of Basharat or for whatever other reason probably felt pretty good about the value they got out of him. Lacerda, by comparison, did not have that same kind of performance as a fill-in against Stamen. So it's interesting here to see Blackshear as the underdog. It is frankly, but I like I said, there's underdog spots on this card that you can feel much better about given you've seen more from them. These are two guys that were champs in lower tier promotions that both have most of their UFC experience illustrated through short notice appearances against good competition, but in one case you had one guy that was able to demonstrate a bit more upfront resistance than what the other guy was. It's interesting that came from the one fighter lined as the underdog. But this is a kind of fight where you just sit back and observe, because you want to get a better read on the winner ideally both these guys, but whichever one of these guys is going to have the longer future with the promotion, you just want to see how they do in this one so you get a better sense of how you can evaluate them going forward. I graded Blackshear. I'm not picking him for what I said. There's just not enough reasons to observe and feel confident. But if you're a frisky dog hunter, as I know some of you value fiends are, Blackshear's probably someone you should consider heavily while he's at plus 125 at the moment. So no pick from me, but if you're going to be a frisky dingo, go ahead and grab Mr. Blackshear and see what happens. Next one. Regrettably, another no pick. Jamie Malarkey and Mohamed Naimov. Mr. Malarkey, this guy. Been a bit of, I don't want to call a thorn in my side, but when I was, the first pay-per-view that I did grades for a year ago was UFC 272. And my first... I didn't quite, as I alluded to last week, one of the problems that I had when I was just trying to, rip every fight and not pick spots was I would hedge on rounds in cases where I wasn't necessarily confident in the winner. One of the earliest examples in which I did that was when Jalen Turner fought Jalen Malarkey last year. Jalen Turner fought Jamie Malarkey. Not a Jalen Malarkey. Jalen Malarkey would be an interesting concept. However, Jamie Malarkey, I graded him to win, and I didn't feel confident in that given I saw the trajectory Jalen Turner was on, which he had an absolutely stellar last year. I thought one of the best of any of the fighters on the UFC roster in terms of building their brand. But I didn't feel confident Malarkey was going to win. But because I thought he would do a relatively decent job of controlling and dictating the fight, I figured it would at least get out past the plus 1.5. I believe the fight ended in the early second round by KO. So I was let down by Mr. Malarkey there, even though I was hedging on rounds. In that case, I wasn't confident in Malarkey, and so I just should have stayed off entirely instead of assuming, I don't think he's going to win, but maybe he can provide enough resistance. That just was not the correct interpretation, and I got bit for it. Even though it was a plus odds play, it wasn't a juiced bet. But Jalen Turner got a good finish, and then he followed it up against Brad Riddell later on in the year, which we made sure to get in on. I believe that was UFC 271? No. 280? No. 274? No. I was at 274. 276? 276. That was international fight. When you run the ladder, these cards just all kind of blend together, so bear with me here. But anyway. Then Malarkey fought Michael Johnson, and I picked Michael Johnson to win, and I'm still stewing about that. I picked Michael Johnson to win at Vegas 73 too. He's the only pick I missed that weekend, and he was winning the fight up until he got caught. That guy, poor guy, has he seemed poised for a nice little late career success, and it just shows you how brutal this game, man, that it can just get away from you on a split decision that went to Jamie Malarkey that many, including myself, believe should not have gone to him. And then Johnson gets caught last weekend fighting Diego, and you just don't know where he sits now. It's tough. That was only the third time he'd been knocked out. I believe it had only been previously by Gaethje and another big name that can crack that is eluding me right now. But anyway, Malarkey got another late replacement bailout in his previous fight, I believe, because he was on the card in Australia at 284. So I don't think that he was lined at a similar price as he is against Naimov, and recollection serves, I don't believe that he really performed a price. I think people expected him to. I remember people betting him to finish as a prop because they thought he would outclass a guy that was a late fill-in, and it didn't happen. He just kind of took the decision. That makes me not want to hedge on rounds for this at all, because I do have Malarkey heavily graded here to win just because of the experience. And if you looked at the stats comparison on the pick I put out, he breezes him in just about everything except attrition. Naimov has never been finished. Malarkey's been finished more than a few times. So if Naimov catches him early, it's possible Malarkey goes down. You don't want to be the guy that bets Jamie Malarkey at 450 and watches your ticket go up in flames. I watched Jake Matthews disintegrate several of my parlays at the last event last year. Another fellow down under man. And that was tough because I bet him at a minus 300 price, and there were an abundance of plays that were better value that I could have gotten other than a Jake Matthews money line that came down to two unfortunate knockdowns. So the price here, pretty much any time you're looking at a minus 400, it just really is not worth it, particularly against these guys that have hardly shown you anything on UFC tape. One of the most raw examples I can remember from last year was Trey Ogden beating Daniel Zaluber, who looked much better this year, but just did not have it when he was a minus 400 favorite in what was effectively his UFC debut in, I believe it was September of last year. So these prices are hardly ever going to be worth it unless you're looking at a guy like an Umar Nurmagomedov fighting a, trash can. So this ain't going to be the play. Malarkey should win, but it's entirely possible he gets caught because I'm hoping he wins because the fade potential here is very good depending on what matchup he gets soon. So I don't see him being able to beat guys like Jalen Turner. We've already seen that demonstrated. He does feel like he has a bit of this low-level gatekeeper quality to him, but he's also 28 years old. Not quite in his prime yet, I don't think, but getting there. He needs to get a finish here tonight and really show people that his career is on a better trajectory than just, scraping by on decisions at this point. So, Jamie Malarkey, good luck to you, but I ain't going to bet you, Chief. So, the much more interesting fight with a Tajikistan fighter on this card is Mr. John Sexy Mexi Castaneda fighting a Mr. Muin Gafarov. That's the first time I've said that name out loud. I've only been reading it all week, so forgive me if I've totally butchered it, Mr. Gafarov. I apologize. However, very interesting one, very close line fight, which is surprising given you don't see that a ton for these late fill-ins, as evidenced by the previous fight also being a late fill-in with a fighter from Tajikistan, making a UFC debut off of a Dana White's Contender Series loss by decision. That's why I think it's at least interesting to at least look at these fights, because most of these late fill-ins, if they haven't even been on Contender Series, don't waste your time. But these guys at least have 15 minutes of tape that you can evaluate for data purposes and, taking away their variables, scanning for any fight IQ problems, and making a decision, based off of that. Sexy Mexi was a guy I picked to beat Daniel Santos back in October, and some people were encouraged by his early performance in the fight. But, Santos proved that, if he weathers that early storm successfully and it's already been taken into a war, he's going to have the grinder mentality to, if you can't match it, he'll put you in a place that's bad. Because that was the first time Castaneda's been knocked out in MMA. And, this is a guy who, submitted Miles Johns previously in the UFC. He just, had to take time to recuperate from that loss. But he I think was on a good trajectory prior to that result. And I do think there's a little bit of disrespect here given that. When I evaluated him, there was a lot of things that I liked about him. And I do think that there's a lot more. His ability to protect his head was not on display against Pineda, but I think part of that was because, you know, he did exert himself when he thought he was going to be in a position to potentially go get a finish early, and then as Pineda was able to kind of turn the tables on him, he sort of paid the price and didn't really have the energy required to effectively defend himself going into the later part of the second round. But prior to that, he had shown a little bit more composure in terms of his defense. And I think that that's something that will pay off here against a guy in Gafarov who does not have encouraging late fight experience. So if Castaneda, given his far greater abundance of UFC experience and not really having to deal with the thrill that Gafarov does of making your debut on a short fill-in notice, I just wonder if that switch is going to be there for that guy to be able to fight the right game plan that he needs to win against a guy that is going to be much more easily be able to force a late stage fight than any of the opponents that Gafarov has previously faced. So if Castaneda is able to avoid getting clipped early, and I think that he's got the skill set in place to keep this fight on his terms and get it into the later rounds. Even if he ends up losing the first round, I'm optimistic that he can rally across the last 10 minutes to get a very solid 29-28. I don't quite have the confidence to make him like a solid parlay leg, and unfortunately, I don't think the books are allowing him as a parlay leg just because the fight was a late fill-in. I know some books take that. They kind of do that at their discretion, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. If you do want to bet Castaneda as a straight, though, I think that you can drink some of the juice. There's just a little bit more at play here in terms of experience variables that I think will make for an encouraging performance against someone that we saw lose a decision on Contender Series and who just hasn't had a great historic performance across his MMA career in fights that went the distance. So go with Castaneda. Sexy Mexi gets a nice bounce back win. I'll enjoy seeing it. What I won't enjoy seeing is this next fight. Don'Tale Mayes, Andrei Arlovski. Now, I got to tell you, there are, at this point, I'm looking at my all-time record, and I've got just shy of about 600 fights that I've graded. So by the end of the month, I'm going to go over 600 lifetime grades in terms of fights where I've looked at two combatants and compared them straight up with the same amount of, or the same set of variables every time and made a betting decision based on what was in play. Don'Tale Mayes, Andrei Arlovski is an abomination of matchmaking. It is a beautiful mess. There are many that have been critical of the sloppy heavyweight fights that have been put together of late. I personally seem to enjoy the chaos. And I do think there's a little bit more value there because there seems to be the perception that, oh, you can't bet on those fights because they're so unpredictable. They'll knock each other out at any time. There's plenty of fights where you bet on a result where each fighter has demonstrated one-punch lights-out ability. I think a good example, in fact, may even be the last fight that we just discussed, or I discussed, rather. John Castaneda and Gafarov. I think both of them have demonstrated single punch knockout ability previously. So I've never really understood that perception in terms of not betting on sloppy heavyweight fights. I do understand the looming sense of dread. I also am very firmly a believer that because you have sloppy heavyweights that may knock each other out at any time with the power they possess, it's never a good play to pick a heavyweight fight to go to decision. If you want to get cheeky with a +1.5, there may be some value there. If it's a guy like Waldo Cortez Acosta, who is primarily going to try to do a little point fight boxing action, but doesn't necessarily have the power to put lights out immediately in the early rounds, or at least after the fight gets out of the early rounds and then as it drags on. So you got to pick and evaluate accordingly. But when you're talking about a fight where there's a 44-year-old fighting a guy who has an 81-inch reach and is 13 years younger and is 3 inches taller, I mean, you see why there are so many people that think if Mays figures it out, he could just be a wrecking machine when you look at him, just based on the frame. And the guy is just an intimidating presence, man, when you look at him. He just looks like a mean, big dude at heavyweight. And his fists look enormous, too. And he's fighting a 44-year-old. So you understand why there are people that are like, no, Mays can finally do it. But then you run the tape and we all see it. We've all seen that north-south position that Mays found himself in. And, I mean, dude, the Sakai fight was, I bet him as an underdog. I can understand betting him as an underdog. You can talk me. If you confidently believe in a plus odds play, I'll at least let you make your case. If you're passionate about it and know what you're talking about. In that sense, if you think there's one variable that puts a fight in favor of an underdog, I can understand making the case to bet them. But when you have to drink juice on a guy like Mays, the move is just not to do it. And by comparison, you cannot bet on a 44-year-old heavyweight fighting a guy 13 years younger than him. Arlovsky's not going to be able to finish Mays. He's a point fighter. And that means Mays could very easily just bulldoze him. But Mays also could very well end up pulling a William Knight and just kind of being a deer in headlights and just allowing himself to get beat, which is what we saw with the Sakai fight. And other appearances from Mays, even against guys like Hamdi who were, getting busted for PEDs afterwards. But the point is, you don't like betting on guys that they talk about. A lot of the technical guys talk about accepting the position. I look at it as kind of like accepting the result. I've seen Mays as a guy that accepts the result. And I can't bet him when he's a favorite because of that. And I can't bet on a guy that's 44 years old fighting someone who's 13 years younger than him. Do not bet this fight. Just watch it. Don't bet Arlovsky at plus odds, because if Mays beats him, it's going to break your heart watching a guy like Mays do that to a future UFC Hall of Famer. It's not worth the risk. Mays is the favorite for a reason, but he's not worth betting for reasons that I've just gone over. Sit back, watch. I'm not going to say enjoy this fight. Get out of it whatever you want and move on to the next one. My God. One of the worst examples of matchmaking I can remember. And I will be rooting for Arlovsky, but if the favored result happens, don't let it break your heart, because it was the expectation. This fight shouldn't be happening. It would be very funny if Arlovsky finishes him and calls it a career. That would be hilarious. And that gets us to, I believe, the final prelim of the evening, which is Daniel Santos and Mr. Johnny Munoz. We successfully hit a parlay that started with Mr. Munoz in his previous appearance over Sholian Ludvik. I'm going to butcher a lot of names on this show because I've read these a million times, but I've just never said them out loud. So please bear with me. None of it is personal. I'm an idiot. Send me feedback. If it's bad, just let me know. If it made you laugh, let me know. But I promise you, it never comes from a place of hate or anything. I half the time I read these and I have no idea what I'm doing. So I only want to be enlightened with knowledge as I want to do the same for you. So, and that guy's also a fellow Ukrainian. So I'm of Ukrainian descent, not a pure-blooded Ukrainian, but I digress. Anyway, Santos Munoz. I already talked about how Santos spoiled, my bet on Castaneda back in October, but Munoz did previously deliver for us. However, one thing that I think about in the purview of Munoz is one of my early results last year that I picked that I was surprised to not see go through was when he fought Tony Gravely, and I figured the two of them were going to get into a pretty effective ground war because I thought they were going to be eager to. Neither one of them had really demonstrated the striking chops, and I figured that they were both going to try to get the best of each other on the ground. And so I took the over on rounds in that fight, and then Gravely waltzed up to him and I believe knocked him out inside of about 2 minutes, and he put him down like bad. So Munoz is liable to get clipped against someone even like Gravely that puts the pressure on him. And with that in mind, we saw what Santos did against Castaneda, who I don't think anybody doubts would beat Munoz right now. I mean, listen, Munoz did get that result against Sholian, but right before that was the Gravely loss that was in 1 minute and 8 seconds, now that I'm looking at it. And prior to that, I mean, he beat Jamie Simmons, but his debut was Nate Maness, and he lost that by unanimous decision pretty handily. Although it was a bit of a closer fight. I believe I remember running tape on that very early in my career as a capper, and I do believe that Munoz fought a closer fight than what it indicated, and that made me want to consider fading Maness in the future, which we successfully did against Tagir Ulanbekov, which I believe was on the same card that Mr. Munoz got his win over Sholian. So it's funny how those, these guys end up on a lot of the same cards pretty often just because of the way the cycles and the matchmaking work. So it's funny how that works, that one night one guy gets the better of the other, and then another night a guy gets caught in a high elbow guillotine and the other one gets a resounding unanimous decision win. Anyway, at UFC 288, I believe, we had the 2.5 under as the pick for this fight, and it ended up getting called off. I believe there was an abscess on Munoz's leg that led to the cancellation. And as I was alluding to early on with the Gravely result, my concern with Munoz was mainly is this guy's body going to be able to withstand a pressure striking session put on by someone like Mr. Silva? Now, we've seen Silva as, with that style that kind of invites that fire, that war. Guys let themselves into mistakes that savvy technical fighters are able to capitalize on and utilize, either for maintaining position that easily wins them around or sets up a finish. in Silva's case, we've seen it result in him getting submitted before. With that in mind, or I'm sorry, in Santos's case, we've seen that with him getting, and he actually hasn't been submitted before. I apologize. We haven't seen him get finished before. So I was incorrect about that. What I'm trying to say here is I don't trust Munoz's chin mainly against Santos's pressure, but I also recognize with a little bit more of the experience Munoz has, it's possible Santos makes a mistake and falls into something that ends up compromising the fight early. That being said, Santos is a 220 favorite. Munoz is the significant underdog. And based on how we saw him deal with when a guy like Gravely just kind of went in and put it on him right away, he hasn't had to deal with that from a lot of high-level fighters. Gravely was the biggest one, and he really didn't deal with it well. So I have to imagine Santos saw that on film and is thinking, I can very easily put this guy away early if I just go throw him into the fire immediately. He doesn't want that. Munoz is a guy that's going to want to get position and use it to set up, his submission attempts and try to get some ground and pound, like clean ground and pound off, not like, steady, effective mount ending position stuff, but just stuff that is going to make him a round winner. So it's a clash of styles in terms of paths to victory, and I don't think that it's going to benefit Munoz well, given how we've seen his chin go before. So I had Munoz graded to win, and I absolutely don't think that that's correct based on the grade. And so I am going to hedge on the rounds here because I have Munoz graded so heavily. If my grade ends up being correct, he probably ends up finishing Santos somehow. But I don't see that being the case. I think there's much more value on the under 2.5, even with the juice. And that was reflected in the fact that at 288, it was lined at 140. And when it came out this week, it was at 175 and still is. So 35 points of value off the board since I tweeted it out a month ago. And now it is where it's at. But I'm results first, value second. I'm already drinking juice anyway, so I still think the result is going to happen. Give me the 2.5 under. I think Santos puts out Munoz probably. If I would guess it probably happens in the first round, but I could also see him just doing the same thing that he did to Castaneda, where he just kicks the hell out of him for 5 minutes, and then once the second round starts, Munoz is already ready for this thing to be done, and Santos just gets an early second round finish. So I think Santos is in good shape here. I'm looking forward to seeing more of his fights. I hope he gets a bit more of a appropriate stylistic matchup in his next appearance. Not picking or betting him, again, just hedging on the rounds because I think either one of these guys are liable to wrap it up before the 2.5 minute mark of the third. So let's go with that. On to the main card. We've been talking for a little bit here. Damn, already 40 minutes. Got so much to talk about these dumb fights. But, okay, I might skip Jim Miller, Jesse Butler in that case. I think it's kind of crazy that Jim Miller's only at 260. I know that he's older, but Butler isn't quite a spring chicken himself and just doesn't nearly have the UFC experience Miller does. And Miller has been quite good in his late performances. So I'm not going to play that fight, and I don't even think it's eligible to be a parlay leg, but I would be heavily considering playing Jim Miller at 260. I think that there's way more value on him at that price than there is on a guy like Jamie Malarkey against a guy like Naimov. So just bear that in mind, but again, not going to be betting that one. However, I am going to be making a play on Abubakar Nurmagomedov versus Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos. We haven't seen Zaleski dos Santos in quite a bit. I believe his last performance was his infamous battle with a guy who has had some significantly better days in the UFC since, Benoit Saint Denis. Zaleski dos Santos, if you recall, that fight at UFC 267 was one of the most infamous referee botch jobs in UFC history. And the official from that evening was immediately relieved of his duties following the match. The commentary team was in an uproar over the fact that Saint Denis was allowed to keep competing. It was unbelievable that that fight went to a decision. But it speaks to how, if you watch the damage from that fight, it speaks to not only how effective Zaleski dos Santos is as a kicker, but also just the never give up spirit that Saint Denis has as a former, I believe they said he was French Special Forces training. So it was a fascinating thing to watch. Great example of what not to do if you're an MMA ref. But that was his last appearance, and that was in October of 2021. So there's been quite a lot of time that has gone since. And again, ring rust, it's one of the biggest things that I consider in evaluating, and it's not something that's always very transparently represented. You've got to go around digging for it yourself a little bit to get a sense of how long guys have really been laid off. Abubakar Nurmagomedov last fought at UFC 280, and I think he got a little bit too close to getting into a guillotine a few times with Gadzio Murgadziev, but he ultimately was able to weather the storm and did grind out another unanimous decision. So he has not won a fight by finish since 2016. I know most of the I've seen a lot of people that believe Abubakar is going to control this fight. I do think he has the effective wrestling skill set to do so, but he's a guy that we've seen is going to be, if not necessarily a lay and pray guy, he's going to aggressively hunt these positions and mitigate all of the things that his opponent does well, and by effectively using technique to shut those off, he's going to win the decision. That's kind of the mentality that you see with a lot of these Dagestani fighters, is just, how do I get as much out of technique as possible so that I can mitigate my opponent's strengths and just focus on what I do best. And we haven't seen the guy win a fight by submission since 2014. Even though he's won fights by triangle and armbar and kimura and rear naked choke, the guy's never had a high-level submission win across World Series of Fighting or PFL or UFC. What he has done is controlled fights and gotten them to go the distance very, very consistently. I think that's interesting, comparing him to a guy like Dos Santos, who has had so many fights go into deep waters. And the thing that I'm most concerned about in this fight is going to be, if I'm not worried about Abubakar getting a finish, am I worried about Zaleski getting a finish on Abubakar? And with the amount of ring rust Zaleski's carrying, I think he's probably going to be a little bit more reluctant to just throw caution to the wind and go out getting a finish at first. I think he's going to be a bit more selective in terms of taking his shots. What I wonder is that over the course of the fight, is he going to deploy more of the spinning attacks that we see from him? And will Abubakar be able to capitalize on those in a way that set up windows for takedowns? And I do think that he is going to be able to do that. I could see Zaleski getting the first round and then Abubakar getting the last two. What I imagine is going to happen is Zaleski wins round one, Abubakar gets round three. Or actually, no, I have that backwards. I think Abubakar wins round one, and I think Zaleski probably turns it up late, realizing that he hasn't done enough and wins round 3. What it comes down to is what's going to happen in the second round, who's going to control that. And I think that's where you have to ask yourself, is it worth betting on a money line in this fight for either one of these guys? I have Dos Santos slightly graded to win. I have him playable as a money line, but because I don't know how that second round is going to be dictated given the layoff that Dos Santos has had, I can't outright pick him here. But what I can do is feel pretty good that given the recent results of these guys, that so many of their fights have gone the distance, even under bizarre circumstances, like the one Dos Santos had with Saint-Denis, there's other guys that they fought that are high-level fighters, if not necessarily Abubakar, but certainly in the case of Dos Santos' debut quietly against Nicholas Dalby went to split decision in 2015. He went to decision with Max Griffin. However, he was also the only guy to ever knock out Sean Strickland prior to Pereira, and he did it with a head kick, arguably in more spectacular fashion than how Pereira did it, but nobody remembers because the face Strickland made after he got knocked out by Pereira was pretty funny. And he was talking about standing and banging, and, it happens. But Dos Santos also went to decision with Salikov, and he did have Salikov hurt in that fight a few times, but wasn't able to capitalize on it. I wonder if against a smart guy like Abubakar, he's going to be able to do the same if he does end up hurting him early. So I think the tentativeness from Dos Santos, because he hasn't fought in so long, may end up costing him. And I think Abubakar has the round-winning skill set to be able to make him pay for that. So I think this fight is probably going to go to the distance for the sake of, parlay legs. If you wanted to play the plus 2.5 at minus 210, it's a lot of juice. But again, results first, value second. I do see this going to a decision. And if it ends up coming down to what happened in that second round, as I was alluding to, do you really want to leave your money up to the scorecards? So I think this is a good case for hedging on rounds. Zaleski could make me look stupid. Wouldn't be the first time I've been humiliated by a Brazilian with sweet kicks this year. Edson Barbosa, you are truly a treasure. But, oh, poor Billy Q. But plus 2.5, Dos Santos, Nurmagomedov. That is the first pick for the main card. Karine Silva, Souza. Again, I don't bet the women's MMA fights. I don't always, or at least I don't grade them because it's going to be a totally different skill set I'm going to have to put together one day. Just because, the different trajectory of the women's fights. But if you do want a flyweight pick, again, I can't encourage you enough. I believe Duck Phillips puts out free picks on his Bet MMA tips page, and he is a women's flyweight sharp. So if he has a play on this, let's go see. Because you tuned in, I'll go do the dirty work for you right now, and I'll look it up. It's like a certain former Chicago Bull basketball player says, you got to give the people what they want. I asked you last week if I'm starting to annoy you yet, and I told you it was only going to get worse from here. So if you didn't believe me, that was your fault. Okay, Duck Phillips. He's ranked 120 in the Bet MMA tips space. He's got a lot of rules for capping and stuff on here too, so I like him a lot. He got kicked off Twitter, and I don't know why. I miss him very much. He has Silva winning by submission as a prop. So if you want to play Silva at 210 money line, that's the same value as the pick I just put out for the previous fight. So if you don't agree with me that you don't think the plus 2.5 rounds is a good play there, you could, potentially roll with Silva at similar odds and get something out of that. So I trust Mr. Duck Phillips. Shout out to him. Yeah, I'm not going to go all the way in on the submission prop just because, betting betting women's MMA inside the distance, if you haven't looked at the specific technicals and abilities of the ladies yourself, is a very risky proposition. But if you want to take Silva money line, it seems like that's the direction that Mr. Doug Phillips is pointing in. So go with that. All right. We got 2 big-time flyweight fights on this main card. And this next one is very interesting given the Twitter drama of late that's gone on with the favorite. And that would be Mr. Tim Elliott. And I'm sure most of you are aware of what's happening or what has happened with Mr. Elliott. It's quite funny to me to observe where both of these guys have been. Just because, I talked about UFC 272 earlier tonight. And I mentioned how Jamie Malarkey let me down there. Another guy that I bet on, and I talk about how one of the ways that you can find value on guys is just by going back in your memory and keeping yourself honest with the truth of what has happened. I talked about how Nate Maness, I thought, didn't really get a unanimous decision over Johnny Munoz, and how I incorporated that into the thinking about the trajectories of both fighters going forward. Because of that, it was interesting to see not only Munoz get his win over Sholian the same night that Maness lost, but Maness lost to Tagir Ulanbekov, who I was very high on going into his fight with Tim Elliott. That is interesting because Elliott received a unanimous decision that many were immediately critical of in the aftermath. The reason I bring this up is because it's so easy to forget context in terms of this, but this is the most recent result Elliott had, and it was in February of last year. And he is fighting a guy in Victor Altamirano who competed as an underdog only 3 months ago, and in the eyes of at least one judge, earned a resounding 30-27 unanimous decision. And he is a guy who has consistently demonstrated not only effective standing volume and the ability to return fire and take a punch, but also the ability to manage cardio effectively in a way where it still makes it ambiguous enough that you're winning the middle of the fight, and then the ability to close out and take the final round when you recognize that you need to take a fight to a decision. Tim Elliott did not win that fight against Tagir Ulanbekov. Tim Elliott had to glove grab his way out of a late choke attempt from Ulanbekov in order to survive to a decision. He admitted in the aftermath of the fight that he cheated, and many fighters do this, not in terms of the post-admission, but in terms of the shameless acceptance of bending the rules and dirty play, because they recognize that this is their livelihood and ultimately winning is the most important result. And that's cute when you're doing something like a glove grab, but when you run into someone who will deliberately start gouging eyes or kicking groins, that becomes a bit of a disturbing concept. That is not a concept that you want in a sport like mixed martial arts. It's an interesting thing to consider in wake of the fact that Tim Elliott was not penalized for that behavior in his fight with Tagir Ulanbekov and received a unanimous decision only about a week after the war between Ukraine and Russia broke out. It's interesting how all of those elements just sort of line up together into a beautiful disaster. Which brings me to the point of the post-fight photo that Tim Elliott took after that result, which included a Mr. Kevin Kroom, as well as the woman that ultimately came between these two men. That Tim Elliott tweeted a photograph of only a few weeks ago of her reading wedding vows to Elliot's daughter on the night that they were married, with Kevin Kroom standing in the background, waiting to be one of the most white trash looking homewreckers in sports history. I don't know where Elliot is mentally. He's talked about it a lot this week, and it seems like he's, in a pretty good place, but it was encouraging to see, Mackenzie Dern talk about her divorce kind of so publicly and then go out and fight such a brilliant fight as she did 2 weeks ago. But men and women are different, and I think women just are going to be able to process that kind of blend of emotion and the messy details of whatever may be going on there better than a man can, quite frankly. We also don't have all of the messy details of what Dern is going through in the way that Elliot made very publicly transparent for everyone else. I don't want to speculate on how a guy is doing mentally, but I do know from watching this guy's fights that he fights dirty in a way that I don't respect. And he's coming off a result that he did not earn. And I'm not saying karma came around for that guy. Nobody deserves what happened to him. And that's a horrible, horrible story. And it shows you the power that even just one lie can have on a person's life. But I have all of that to consider against a guy that has been a winner for me, like Victor Altamirano has over his recent appearances. And I look at the late round performance of Elliot over his MMA career and the trajectory he's on at 36 years old. And I compare that to Altamirano and the trajectory he's on and the results he's had much more recently. And in context of that and the ring rust, I look at this and I say, how in the world is Victor Altamirano a plus 150 underdog in this fight? I've done a lot of praising to Piglord. He's, one of the guys that I formed my entire betting mentality off of based on the wealth of knowledge he had out there last year before he put a lot of his content behind a paywall. One of the things that he has, I believe, still pinned at the top of his Twitter profile is a quote about, or just a mentality really of, the best lines should jump out at you, as in you evaluate all of your elements in play and then you go look. You shouldn't look at something and say, oh, I think there's a bit of value here. It should scream at you, this is not interpreted correctly. Victor Altamirano should be favored in this fight. It is bizarre that Tim Elliott is favored. I believe Tim Elliott is favored because there are a lot of people that are going to be rooting for him without the full context of who he is as a martial artist and what his record says about him. I'm hammering Victor Altamirano tonight. Bet him as a straight. Put him in your parlays. I think there's incredible value on this guy. It's going to be, I think that it could potentially turn out to be a war, but I think that Altamirano is much more equipped for a war realistically than Elliott is. I think people would just like to see Elliott win that war for his story, but his story doesn't have all the context in terms of why you should bet him or stay off. And for that reason, I think there is immense value on Victor Altamirano tonight. And that brings us to the co-main event, Alex Caceres, Daniel Pineda, which I alluded to at the top of the show. It's bizarre that Pineda finds himself in a co-main. I was fading this guy against Tucker Lutz as a main leg of a parlay back at Vera Sandhagen, which was probably the most disastrous night of the year that we've had. Lutz did not land. We bet Steven Peterson against, I don't even remember the name of the guy he lost to be honest, but it was not good. It was a guy coming off a Contender Series appearance, and, you think the experience is going to pay off, and then a guy decides in the middle of the fight he wants to retire. So, bad night all around. And then watching Lutz, who I was very concerned about the layoff, but recognized Pineda was coming off a similar one, figured, yeah, I think Lutz will get it done against a guy who's 37, probably on his way out. But Pineda looked better and turned the tables. But a lot of people coming out of that fight saw the same thing, which was, how much did this guy really demonstrate versus how much did we really learn about Tucker Lutz from this? And I think a lot more people got the full picture on Tucker Lutz than they did on where Daniel Pineda's at 37 years old. You compare that to the result Alex Caceres just had, where he had been coming off a pretty decent amount of ring rust, and, you don't losing a decision like he did to Sadiq Youssef heading into your mid-30s, never the best look. But he bounced back and got an extremely good finish against Julian Erosa, which I had Erosa graded to win, but I stayed off. No, I didn't stay off betting Erosa, but I did leave Erosa out of most of my major parlays. Because I recognized that, Caceres was kind of a wild card, but he got one of the cleanest head kicks of the year last year. And he's got a pretty decent resume of late, too, honestly. You take out that Sadiq Youssef loss, and the guy is 7-1 going back to the middle of 2019. It's funny, his only loss was to Kron Gracie, which just shows you how much of a demon ring rust can be for some people. But this is a guy who you can point to at 34, and if you turn the clock back 4 years to when he was 30, which is the middle of the prime, you see a lot of split decisions over the course of his career, and then against a pretty decent slate of competitors in here, including Steven Peterson, Chase Hooper, Kevin Kroom, Sungwoo Choi, Julian Erosa. Really able to, these are names that were able to stick on the roster up until at least last year. And he, either finished them or earned the unanimous decision over them, which he had been losing a lot of splits in his UFC career to guys that maybe he should have otherwise won. So this is a guy you can point to, and even though you recognize he's coming out of his prime now and probably going into the decline, he's not as far into that yet as Pineda has to be. And that's an important thing to consider. I look at this and I just see so many different ways where this goes wrong for Pineda. And again, this is another fight where you just absolutely love the edge in experience, not only for the UFC, but also from a full fight and final round perspective. Alex Caceres has gone to decision 14 times in his MMA career. Pineda's gone 5 times. In those 5 times, Pineda, across his 42 MMA appearances, has gone to decision. He's never won. Daniel Pineda has no wins by decision in his MMA career. He's lost every time. He has one split decision win. He has a split decision loss. So on at least one scorecard, he did win a decision. But otherwise, he's lost every time. And he's fighting a guy who has made 27 UFC appearances and has 3 wins by decision across his last 7 results. I'm sorry. He's got six wins. So I was doing the math wrong, but my point stands. 3 wins by decision across his last 6 by unanimous. So half of his fights. And he's shown a well-rounded ability, the 2 submissions and the KO. Pineda is a guy who has never won a fight other than by finish at 37 years old with 4 UFC appearances, and his only win by finish prior to the Tucker Lutz fight, someone who hadn't fought in 2 years, was against Herbert Burns. And I know there's plenty of people on MMA Twitter that have things to say about Gilbert's little brother that he carried out of the ring last year. So bear that in mind. You got to drink juice on Caceres to play him, but I don't think the line here is wide enough compared to a lot of the other ones on this. I think if Caceres avoids making a really dumb mistake early, which the thing that he needed to gain was the mental composure, and he's demonstrated that over the last 4 years of his career, that is far more encouraging than anything you've seen from Pineda based on him finishing a guy that was coming off of a 2-year layoff just like Pineda was. I just don't see it for Pineda here. I was fading him last fight, and he made me pay for it, but Father Time's undefeated, and Caceres has a lot more in terms of experience that we can look to and lean on in this than we did Tucker Lutz, who was at a worse price last time out. Give me Caceres. I'm making him a parlay leg this week. I feel very good about where he's going, even as he enters the decline of his career. I think he is an interesting name to monitor at featherweight, just relative to some of the other guys that are floating around that space. So we'll see how it works out for Mr. Caceres. That brings us to the main event. Kai Kara France and Amir Albazi. Mr. Kara France. This guy started out last year on a pretty good note. Had quite a war with Askar Askarov. But I think that fight really holds the key to what is going to allow Albazi to be successful in this. Now, I talk about trajectories a lot on this card. I've said that's a theme, and that continues to be one here because Kara France, I watched that fight with Askarov, and it was on mute. And honestly, watching it on mute, I thought it could have gone either way. So it was surprising to see Kara France get a unanimous decision. I know Askarov mostly leaned on his control time, but he really did almost finish that fight early. And Kara France demonstrated that his striking was better, and I can see why he definitely, I wouldn't have been upset with a 29-28, and it feels like that's what he got in his favor based on how he did the last 10 minutes. However, I did think that result had a bit more ambiguity to it than most people relented in wake of it. I think Askarov definitely felt disrespected by it, which is part of the reason that he's no longer in the UFC, although I know obviously he had his weight-cutting issues prior to fighting Royval. It was a shame to see him go. I was hopeful that guy was going to be a flyweight champion just because it would have been cool to see someone legally disabled do that in the UFC. But Kara France seized the momentum and took it to a title fight with Brandon Moreno, where this guy, Kara France, has a lot of fans, and I get why. But there were so many people that were just betting on him to beat Moreno because they recognize the value on him and, all the narrative. You cannot bet on fighters because you're fans of them. I had to learn that lesson with Charles Oliveira against Islam Makhachev. It'll break your heart, But if you want to break the bank, it's just the reality you have to embrace. And I look at this fight, and I'm seeing a lot of it's lined as a pick'em, and I wonder if that is because there's a lot of people that are just wishfully thinking that Kara France is going to be able to get over that contender hump at this point in his career. And we just have seen that he does not have it for these guys that are able to really take it into another level, like Brandon Royval or Brandon Moreno. The guys that fight a little bit too safe, that aren't really will imposers, he's able to, punish them. I am worried he's going to end up settling in as a high-level gatekeeper, which in a class that is full of ripe contenders, that's a really tough role to occupy. But it feels like that's where his career is heading relative to what we've seen against really, really high-level elite competition, but still a better competition than what Albazi has had. But once he just gets into those moments where it becomes more difficult to get over the hump, you just wonder how much further he's going to be able to go. And that, you think about that relative to a guy like Albazi, who, when you're evaluating the progression of a guy on his way to title contention, every person that evaluates fights from a technical perspective on a long-term plane has said this guy has shown the development that you want to see. It was on display with how he won his fight against Alessandro Costa, who I believe was a late fill-in, not by days, but he, I believe, was supposed to have a higher level fight and his opponent pulled out. And it was the last UFC event of the year, and they wanted to make sure they got him the result. He had demonstrated strong ground game to that point, but the striking was still a bit open for interpretation in terms of how good is he really. For him to go out and get a finish like he did was very encouraging. I had the under 2.5 rounds on that fight, and I wasn't watching it live, but I remember thinking that was going to end up being a bad bet and that it was dumb to just fade Costa, especially because I believe in hindsight, Costa had only been knocked out once prior to that, but he did end up getting finished and put away by Albazi, and that was impressive in the sense that he hadn't shown an ability to finish fights like that at this level before. It was his first win by knockout in MMA since 2015. Very, very, very encouraging sign from Albazi. So he's on a 5-fight win streak now. There's an interesting study that I was looking into last year that kind of talked about, it was a study that attempted to illustrate when a fighter makes that transition from thinking that they're just like realistically a very high level martial artist to championship caliber. Where does that winning kind of confidence come in where you believe you're better than the guy that you're off against? And you're going to be able to deploy your game plan more effectively than him, regardless of what obstacles they may be presenting. You're simply confident in your ability to interpret your opponent's skill set and neutralize it in a way that lets you get your desired result. The interesting thing was the study found that this tends to happen for fighters when they hit their 5-fight win streak. So as they prepare to enter their 6th bout, about 62.5% of the time, which does provide an edge compared to, something that's a bit closer to the middle of 50 to 45%, which is the case of a 1-fight win or loss streak, which is what Kara France is carrying coming off the loss to his former roommate, Brandon Moreno. The big thing that I think about in evaluating these two skill sets is Albazi was visibly the stronger guy at the weigh-ins. And while Cara France may be the more technical striker, when Cara France is eligible to be giving up the takedown opportunities, one thing that we have seen from him is a bad habit of giving up the back. Even though his takedown defense is strong, we've seen him give his back up too easily. And Albazi is a high-level enough ground game and grappler that if he's able to get in on these spots when, Cara France is throwing kicks or what have you, in a similar way with Abubakar Nurmagomedov against Dos Santos, are those spinning attacks or are those kicks, those moments where you're exposing your legs and your limbs to being latched onto, is Albazi going to be able to get on this guy, get his back, and what happens after that? Is he able to stay on him the way Askarov is? Is Cara France going to be able to dispose of a guy like Albazi as easily as he was Askarov? And I wouldn't even say easy, because most people would agree that Cara France lost the first round and wasn't able. All he was able to do was survive the choke attempts from Mr. Askarov. So the path to victory here, I think, for Albazi is much clearer than it is for Cara France. Cara France needs to outstrike for 25 minutes. It's certainly possible. It's not out of the question. But when we consider the place that these guys are at, one's 29, one's 30, so they're both in their prime. In terms of guys that are still able to make improvements, who has been better at improving their weaknesses of late by comparison? Albazi's knock has been his striking. We saw him win by knockout in his last fight. Cara France's knock has been his defensive grappling beyond his takedown defense. And we've seen him dominated within the last year on his back by, maybe not dominated, but we've seen the guy not only lose by liver kick on the feet, we've also seen a guy with a more complete skill set like Moreno make him pay in a 5-round fight that didn't even get to round 3. And we've also seen Cara France display the bad habit of giving up his back, which I think Albazi will be able to take advantage of and possibly find a submission for. I don't know if this fight is going to go the distance. I think it's probably more likely it ends inside. It is a flyweight bout. These are crazy. I do think there's considerable value on Albazi at the price that he's at, because this fight has essentially been a pick 'em all week, and now there's some, as the sharps have started to voice their opinions, the late money has started to come in on Albazi. So I'm taking Albazi. I'm making him a parlay leg too. So Caceres, Albazi, it's kind of scraping the barrel for some of this other stuff. Based on my confidence, I should just make Altamirano the third pick, but that price is high enough that I'm wondering if maybe some of my read is off base. But I do think that there are just a lot of people that are emotionally betting Elliott and rooting for him, and I think that betting as a fan is never a good strategy relative to what the results are actually telling you is on table. So I considered Abubakar Nurmagomedov Dos Santos for the third leg of our usual 3-leg parlay. 210 is a little bit too juicy of a price for me. I feel better about Munoz Santos ending inside 2.5 rounds. So I think I'm going to go with that for my third leg, and I will put that out shortly. However, that concludes the RAXPOD beta for UFC Vegas 74. I want to thank you very much for listening. I said I was going to try to keep these between 30 minutes to an hour last week, and it looks like this is going to an hour and a half, but I ended up talking about the fights that I didn't even put out a pick on. So I've been ranting into a microphone for an hour and 20 minutes. Can you believe that? And I just keep talking about all these dumb fights, about people punching each other in the face and kicking each other in the stomach and pressing each other up against the cage. How does a person talk about all this dumb violence for so long? There's got to be something else going on in this sport, right? Oh, there's everything going on in this sport. It's the most fascinating sport there is because it's the most raw reflection of life we have. Many years ago, I wrote about how once we get out of our college age, we tend to start living with we start living for Saturdays with only a fraction of the enthusiasm that we had when we were on campus as kids. And this sport has made that no longer true, at least for me. I recognize that it may be still the case for a lot of people, but I work all week just so that I can drink in the joy of watching these guys compete, and the ladies too. But being able to see these guys go and try to make their dreams reality every week after I put in all this work to figure out if they're going to do it or not. It's just a pure joy to watch it play out on that canvas every week. So regardless of what the results may be, I hope you all enjoy watching them with me. And I want to thank you very much for tuning in. We love Saturdays over here at the RAXPOD Beta. And I don't know if these are going to keep coming out on Saturdays going forward, but we will try to get them out somewhere between Thursday, Friday, or Saturday on a rolling basis so that you can make the right decisions prior to the prelims kicking off. But one more time, thank you very much for tuning in. This has been the MMA RAXPOD for UFC Vegas 74. Still in beta, but making progress.
Every time I call you, I